Okay, here we go. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the June ArcSoc talk. I'm here with Dr. William Archer. He's calling in from Bloemfontein, and he's in a much colder venue than I am this evening, although it does look like the cold front has moved through the whole of the country. We had wonderful rain over the last couple of days in Cape Town. And I have got a backup presentation by Will, just in case we have any poor internet connectivity issues this evening. So I do have a backup link, which I can share with all of you, just in case we have any issues this evening. But we're going to proceed with this live stream in the meantime, and just take it as it goes. And hopefully we won't need to use the backup presentation. So Will's talk this evening is about exploring pattern and pace in Southern African human behavioural evolution, and it's a view from the southwestern Cape. And the abstract is online, but I'll quickly summarise it. It's all about his work at Montagu Cave and at other sites. And he's looked at the ecological context and the geochronology and technological variability, reflecting probable occupation of the cave at the onset of interglacial conditions in MIS 7. So if any of you have any problems with the terminology used this evening, or if you need explanation of some of the terms, please pop those into the chat box, and I'll see if I can explain some of those, or we can shift some of those questions to the end as well for some of you who may not or may struggle with some of the more complex terms, and hopefully Will can keep it entry level and easy to understand for all of you. Basically, Will's been looking at the earlier, if you like, MSA. So this is sort of 300,000 years ago in different parts of Africa, and in particular the classic Acheulean in the southwestern Cape, which these researchers looking at how long it may have persisted here, and perhaps a bit later than was previously thought. Will is a researcher who focuses on quantitative approaches to generating high-quality data sets through the study of stone artefacts and through excavations of new promising archaeological sites with reliable recovery methods. Broadly, he's employed these approaches in collaboration with colleagues to explore the effects of ecological contexts on hominin behavioural evolution in periods spanning the last 2.7 million years. As I say, he's been working at Montagu Cave, but he's also worked in Kenya and at various other places all over South Africa. We studied together at GCT many years ago, so he's a dear friend, and he was one of the archaeologists also volunteering his time, which we were very appreciative of, at the Markies River Rock Shelter recently in the Southern Cape. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Will, and we're looking forward to this talk. So Will, go for it.
Thanks, Nick. And thanks to the Society in general for inviting me to give a talk at your session tonight. I just want to say at the outset that I'm not going to be discussing the details of any of these specialist avenues of research associated with the Montagu Cave project. But when I do talk about the Montagu Cave project, I'd like to say that this project does implicate the research of a large number of close collaborators who are listed on this opening slide, and they've made substantial contributions to the research and to the fieldwork at the site. So today I'm going to talk about the Southern African archaeological record relating to and directly preceding the emergence of so-called modern human behavior. I'll start off with discussing the Middle Pleistocene sequence at Montagu Cave, and then I'll deviate a bit from my abstract, and I apologize for that, but I thought it would be relevant to today's presentation when I was putting it together. And I'll shift to an analysis-focused project that's really focused on exploring stone artifact data at much larger spatial geographic scales, focused also primarily on Southern Africa, but there are implications of the second part of my talk for the African continent more generally. So exploring the emergence of modern behavior from its inception in Africa can potentially be boiled down to several core questions. Probably one of the main ones being, what did it mean to be an early modern human in Africa? As a species, we really distinguished from many, I don't say all, but many other species by our unique capacity for culture, including the continuous invention of new complex tools, new ideas, and new social forms. Today, these behavioral capacities translate into communication devices like smartphones in the top left, complex technologies like computers, expressive personal body art like tattoos, and jewelry. But in the archaeological past, these capacities manifested in very different kinds of Middle and later Stone Age technological systems, as well as social signifiers like personal engravings. When I talk about complex Middle Stone Age technologies, that's a photo or a drawing by Michel Grenet of a bifacial point, potentially projectile weapon on the bottom right of the slide, as well as personal engravings and beadwork as well. The African archaeological record ties the emergence of modern human behavior and its spread out of Africa to these very behavioral capacities. So in a narrow sense, as Stone Age Africanists, archaeologists, we are very much interested in how, when, where, and at what pace our ancestors started exhibiting the fully modern human capacity for culture and innovation. Some scientists have argued, quite controversially perhaps, these days, that the earlier archaeological record associated with Homo sapiens in Africa is relatively homogeneous across vast geographic regions, at least when compared to the later Pleistocene record, and this is absolutely fair. And this earlier MSA record primarily is characterized largely by prepared core systems, unstandardized points, and various kinds of larger bifacial tools. When the archaeological record becomes interesting for different reasons is when humans started doing different things in different places in Africa, in different climatic and ecological settings. This happens by 100,000 years ago at the very latest, when we start to see numerous different regionally specific signatures of early cultural complexity. This is a formal term, unfortunately, but I will discuss it and define it later on in the second half of my talk. But for now, I'm using the terms cultural complexity and modern human behavior rather interchangeably. So the timing, patterning, and drivers of the shift that I've described in the last two slides from a relatively homogeneous Pan-African technology that I would argue personally, and some of the people I work with would also argue, that it varies spatially primarily in relation to changing ecological variables like different resource availabilities in different environments, to later cultural systems with more diverse and spatially complex structures is a matter of ongoing debate. Several models have been proposed to explain these broad temporal changes in Stone Age technologies over the last, say, 400,000 years of human evolution in Africa. And I'll just focus on two of the main ones here, although there are a few others which are sort of subtle variants on these two main models, most of them. It's probably fair to say that a currently slightly less popular model amongst Stone Age Africanists, at least in its classical original form, is the so-called behavioral revolution model. This model was originally developed by Richard Klein, I think in the late 90s, and it argues that hominin capacities for culture and innovation shifted abruptly around 50,000 years ago, and that there's very little evidence for absolutely uniquely human behaviors in the archaeological record prior to this point. But we know now with the availability of new radiometric dating techniques and the high resolution excavation of far more sites, particularly in Southern Africa, that several key innovations likely emerged before 50,000 years ago, but the temporal pattern of change predicted within the behavioral revolution model, as well as its particular drivers, in my personal view, remain very much open questions. So the specific timing and causality implicated in Klein's model does not pertain to the current discussion, in my view. But what I would argue is that the logistic pattern of temporal behavioral change showed by this in the slide by this S-shaped model potentially does relate to the current discussion. This temporal trajectory shows a stasis change stasis pattern of behavioral innovative change through time. And this is a pattern that was described originally by Henrich in the early 2000s and then expanded on by Bettinger, and it's relatively well established in cultural evolutionary studies. The logistical uptake of new innovative behaviors is dependent on the changing breadth of material cultural variation in a particular population through time, with new technologies that might move into a particular region spreading faster after a period of relative stasis, first at an increasing and then a decreasing rate. An alternative so-called gradualist model was suggested originally by McBretti and Brooks, and it's supported, or is, I guess, argued to be supported by environmental records in Eastern Africa that document increasing variability associated with the emergence of behaviorally modern Homo sapiens in that particular region. Some Southern Africanists would probably argue that the proposed deep antiquity of complex Middle Stone Age technologies in South Africa, such as, for example, what's argued to be bladed production, stone heap treatment, and ochre use, particularly on the south coast, some authors have argued that this potentially provides some, at least local support for this gradualist model. This model argues for a gradual loss of archaic technologies and a concurrent gradual assembling of modern human behaviors over the last 400,000 years in Africa. Within this theoretical framework, we might expect to see so-called transitional industries that have mosaics of both Acheulean and Middle Stone Age technologies, such as the Force-Smith transitional industry, for example, or the equivalent transitional industries that you have sort of at the temporal interface between the late Acheulean and the Middle Stone Age in more equatorial geographic settings, such as in Central Africa and in Eastern Africa as well. The site of Montagu Cave, located here in the blue region on this raster map, is an unusual site for several reasons, which is why I got interested in it originally. And it's potentially also an interesting case study for exploring the temporal pattern of cultural change in the southwestern Cape of South Africa. It's a cave site in a region that has some of the richest and most well-dated Middle Stone Age cave sites in Africa. So this map is showing Pleistocene sites in Southern Africa that are classified by geochronological period, namely those sites that have published ages between 200,000 and 20,000, and that's the vast majority of cave occupations that we have in Southern Africa, have ages within that time frame. And then the other group is those sites that have ages between, those sites in general that have ages between 400,000 and 200,000. There are very few sites in the Western Cape that have ages between 400,000 and 200,000. And the bottom line is that cave occupations with ages older than 200,000 are extremely rare in Africa in general. So Montagu Cave is located in the year-round rainfall zone, as I insinuated already, which is represented on this particular map by a particularly low coefficient of variation between the amount of summer and winter rainfall received by the region surrounding the site, meaning that it receives rainfall basically all year round, or a substantial part of the year. Montagu Cave is also located in the Cape Floral Kingdom, which has been a stable bioregion since at least the later Miocene, so probably for the last 5 million years at least. The site's actually technically in the west montane part of the fynbos biome, which, according to Cowling and colleagues, is apparently the richest sub-region of the Cape Floral Kingdom. This area has exceptionally high levels of biodiversity, with rich flora consisting of many endemic edible geophytes and other nutrient-rich underground sources of plant foods, such as those that are being shown on the left-hand side of the slide. So the vicinity of the site, just to quickly recap on the last couple of slides, shown here in its geological context, it receives rainfall and has potentially abundant plant-based food resources available all year round. Just a quick sort of historical recap of the history of excavation at the site. It's been excavated on several previous occasions. Firstly, in 1919, perhaps I should say quite unfortunately, it was excavated then rather unsystematically. And you can see the footprints of this first excavation here on the right-hand side of the slide in a sort of amorphous green translucent polygon, which is actually on a structure from motion model of the cave with the roof cut off. Then in the 1960s, it was far more meticulously dug by Professor Charles Keller from Berkeley. This was part of his PhD research at the time. Keller's excavation recovered in excess of 275,000 stone artifacts. And although some components of the collections from these excavations that I've described so far in general were subsequently transported to foreign institutions, and unfortunately they haven't returned to South Africa, many of them. So when we talk about the collections from Montagu Cave at Aziko, they're actually substantially smaller than this figure. A portion of unexcavated deposits pertaining largely to the Acheulean sequence at Montagu Cave was left intact at the site under a collapsed roof fall. So, you had to remove substantial quartzite boulders to actually get to the archaeological deposit, which is probably why it remained. But this is what we focused our field work on between 2014 and 2017. So this is showing our recent excavations of the lower Acheulean deposits at Montagu Cave. And the view here in the slide is out the mouth of the cave looking to the east on a particularly stormy Cape winter's day. On the right-hand side are photos of in situ hand axes. So what I mean by that is hand axes that have been excavated from a deposit that we know they are associated with, and we can date the deposits and date the behaviours associated with the cultural remains found in that deposit. That's what I mean by in situ. These bifacial tools in this particular slide were excavated from the two stratigraphic layers that we were able to date that I'll discuss in the following slides. So the two plots on the right, up on the right-hand side of the slide, just above and below these hand axes, are graphs, and they're quantitative plots related to what we call two-shot specimens from our excavation of these particular layers. In short, what this means is when you measure three-dimensional coordinates at the two ends of elongated clasts that occur in an archaeological deposit, such as elongated stone artifacts, on an aggregate level, you can take this information and you can access information about the formation processes that led up to the accumulation and deposition of that deposit. So it tells us about site formation. So I'm not going to go into the details of what the data actually mean, unless people would like me to. I can discuss this at the end. But for now, I'll just summarize it by saying that the piece plotted data, the spatial data from our excavations show that the dated layers had very limited post-depositional effects, and that the excavated finds are very much in a close to primary context. Okay, so we can be sure that whatever ages we get, if the ages are reliable, are associated with the behaviours that are represented within the cultural remains in those dated layers. Interestingly, despite the abundance of Middle and later Stone Age cave occupations in the Western Cape, Montagu Cave is one of only 3 cave sites in South Africa with in situ Acheulean assemblages. So for the non-archaeologists who may be listening to this talk, when I'm talking about the Acheulean more generally, I'm talking about a technological and behavioural complex in human prehistory that conventionally, in terms of conventional understanding, preceded the the material cultural record associated with Homo sapiens. Acheulean technologies are characterized by what we call biface production, which are also perhaps slightly misleadingly known as hand axes and cleavers, because in most cases we don't really know what they were used for. But some of these tools are shown on the top left of the slide. These kinds of large bifacial tool technologies are not conventionally associated, as I touched on already, with the activities of modern humans, right? Certainly no Homo sapiens fossils that I'm aware of have been found in association with excavated Acheulean assemblages in Africa. Rather, the few early Homo sapiens remains that we know of from the Middle Pleistocene, and there are few of them, have been found exclusively with Middle Stone Age assemblages. So on the top left-hand side, these bifaces are actually from our dated layers, okay, in the lower Acheulean sequence. Interestingly, the bifaces from the dated layers are dominated by these so-called cleaver forms, and I'll get to why that may be relevant in a couple of slides' time. So the plot on the right-hand side of this slide is showing the density of finds in our excavations of the upper Acheulean sequence at Montagu Cave. So every individually colored point in the slide is an Acheulean artifact or piece of, is an Acheulean cultural remain. So an artifact or piece of ochre or something else. So in short, the site provides an extremely rich cultural snapshots on the archive just preceding the Middle Stone Age in this region. Geochronologists, members of our team, Doctors Deborah Colarossi and Tobias Lauer, have been trying to date the Montagu sequence for the last 8 years or so. And, you know, just to summarize, it's an extremely challenging period and geological context to date. The unpublished ages are received are in MI7 in general, so very broadly between 240 and 220,000 years ago. My understanding is that this is a slightly warmer period, so the region would potentially have been maybe a bit wetter and probably more habitable than the subsequent MI6, for example. Unfortunately, I can't go into the details of the individual ages that we have because they're unpublished. Suffice to say that this is unexpectedly late for a classic Acheulean site in South Africa. Interestingly, the only potentially contemporaneous southwestern Cape site to Montagu Cave is a site called Danafontein 2 actually, which is about 180 kilometers due west of Montagu Cave. It's on the Western Cape coast, very near Coburg. Danafontein has biostratigraphic ages. What I mean by biostratigraphic is ages derived from the faunal assemblages associated with the artifacts, right? And these biostratigraphic ages are around 250 to 300,000. Relevantly, this is a period wherein one might expect to see so-called Foresmith industries, transitional industries, further north in South Africa, as well as in the central interior. And it's been previously suggested that Danafontein may actually be transitional, not by Klein and his colleagues who excavated the site, but by more recent commentators who made some comments on the collection. Although it's a very small lithics assemblage in general, and my understanding is that Klein and colleagues argue that it may even not be directly associated with the fossils. That's not 100% clear. Few to no technological components of the Montagu Cave assemblage excavated within our excavations of the sites between 2014 and 2017 are indicative of transitional industries or of Middle Stone Age technologies. There's nothing that looks anything Middle Stone Age in what we've excavated. In fact, the Acheulean sequence at Montagu Cave is dominated by behaviours or technological activities related to biface production and clear evidence for smaller flake production or retouched tool production that one might expect in Middle Stone Age industries is comparatively minimal, or I should say non-existent. So these are some other bifaces from the layers that we were able to date. And even the cores. So what I mean by cores is nodules of stone that served as resources for the production of smaller stone artifacts such as flakes. The number of cores in the Acheulean layers are substantially less numerous than the bifaces, which is even unusual for classic Acheulean sites, in my experience. So despite the young ages for the Acheulean of Montagu Cave, the bifaces are not similar to typical Fordsmith bifacial tools in any way. They differ in several respects in terms of, looking at the assemblage level, the high frequency of bifaces in the assemblage. Secondly, the abundance of cleavers in the Montagu Cave collections. So it's dominated by cleavers as opposed to more classic ovate hand axes. And this would be extremely unexpected for Fordsmith assemblage, to my knowledge. And thirdly, what's shown on this size is the large size of the bifaces from the Acheulean at Montagu Cave. The bifaces from Montagu Cave, in terms of size and morphology, are actually much more similar to local bifaces from Elandsfontein, for example, than to published Fordsmith hand axe data. And Elandsfontein may be as old as 1 million. So if one considers the ages and the Acheulean technologies excavated from Montagu Cave in the context of the well-dated Middle Stone Age sites in this immediate region that are only potentially around 50,000 years younger, it becomes difficult to reconcile the archaeological record of this particular region in the Southwestern Cape with a gradualist model. This raises the question, if you have classic Acheulean technologies as late as MIS 7, would one expect technologies to change or evolve so drastically by MIS 6, wherein we already have Middle Stone Age on both the south and west coasts? So if one accepts the regionalized persistence of the classic Acheulean in the Southwestern Cape, one possible explanation for the abrupt shift between the later Acheulean and the early MSA in this region is what's known as population turnover or cultural turnover. In other words, to summarize, what this means is populations potentially moving into the region, bringing with them early Middle Stone Age technological systems, and very, very rapidly replacing local Acheulean technological systems or local Acheulean populations, however you want to look at it. In my personal view, based on what we know generally about archaeological indications of population migration of past mobile communities, such as the morphologies of tool form and aspects of raw material procurement and transport, and what we know about these indicators in the local early MSA, a more likely explanation, in my view, for the pace of Middle Pleistocene behavioural change in the Southwestern Cape is of a punctuated cultural change after 220,000, where Acheulean technologies are suddenly lost and the subsequent Middle Stone Age in the region abruptly develops. In this alternative scenario, there would be no visible overlap between so-called archaic, and what I mean by this is Acheulean, and so-called modern technological systems, which is associated probably with the Middle Stone Age, as is argued to be the case in Eastern Africa, and as is argued to be the case, by implication, with so-called transitional industries like the Fordsmith, which occur in the central and northern interiors of South Africa. So just to sum up this part of the talk with 3 main points, Montagu Cave is the youngest documented Acheulean site in Southern Africa, well documented and well dated. I shouldn't say well dated, but quite yet, but well documented Acheulean site in South Africa. The ages we have do not overlap with the Middle Stone Age substantially in the immediate region and implicate occupation of the cave in a slightly warmer period. So in a behavioral ecological sense, perhaps are potentially plausible. Hominids were making the Acheulean in the Southwestern Cape, while the Middle Stone Age was already established further north in southern Africa. And I have to say that much work is needed to explore this regional patterning further. However, archaeological evidence for modernity does not persist through the Middle Pleistocene into the present after we see the first evidence for it in the archaeological record. Rather, evidence for different complex material cultures comes and goes and has this sort of flickering pattern in the archaeological record until after 35,000, perhaps, when all of these classic indicators of so-called modern human behavior sort of persist all through the main regions that we know, much about in terms of Stone Age archaeology of Africa. Many explanations have been proposed to explain this flickering pattern. I won't go into them individually. I just want to take a look at one of these today, which is the so-called demographic hypothesis, which suggests that cultural complexity in our lineage arose as a response or partial response to increasing group size and/or increasing levels of group social interconnectedness across the landscape. The archaeological prediction is that larger populations in the past should have been associated with more complex material cultures than smaller, more marginally socially interconnected groups. There's been a back and forth about this in the literature, mostly between non-archaeologists, and I think it's fair to say that the issue is still unresolved. The bottom line from an archaeological perspective is that it's been extremely challenging to develop a reliable test for the demographic model that is applicable to the known archaeological record of Africa. I was interested in trying to do this, and the first issue one faces in this endeavor is that complexity is represented in the archaeological record by a huge array of different kinds of stone artifacts and other aspects of material culture. And certainly from a quantitative modeling perspective, we can't focus our attention on all of them, right? So what makes an appropriate proxy for past cultural complexity? What I'm going to argue in this particular talk is that what we call backstone artifacts, these crescent-shaped, pointed or double-pointed like stone artifacts that are depicted on the slide, I'm going to argue that they have three characteristics which make them suitable. Firstly, in the Middle and later Stone Age, backstone artifacts were, in many contexts, unquestionably associated with multi-component or composite tools, like the two drawings on the right-hand side of the slide. Secondly, they are also spatially and temporally ubiquitous in Africa. What I mean by this is, within at least the last 100,000 years, you always have them somewhere, and they persist on and off up to the ethnographic present. From a quantitative modeling perspective, this kind of data structure is really, really important. They were also often made with elaborate multi-level production processes. For example, in later Pleistocene Southern Africa, these processes had been argued to have potentially involved heat treatment of certain kinds of rocks, which is a process which potentially has multiple hierarchically nested levels of production. In the context of silkweed heat treatment, it's a rock that you get in the southwestern Cape. This potentially involved the ecological knowledge of which silkweeds in the environment respond favorably in terms of fraction mechanics to being heated, knowing which woods and the amount of woods to collect in the environment to build a fire that's going to be really hot and can be sustained for a long time, burying the nodules of silkweeds a specific distance below the fire to manage the gradual uptake of heat in these nodules, otherwise they explode, maintaining a constant temperature of the above surface fire for a long period of time, managing the gradual cooling of the nodules, otherwise they explode again, removing them from the context in which they were heated, making standardized blanks, making backed artifacts in the blanks, hafting those backed artifacts. And what I'm trying to get at with this description is multiple hierarchically nested levels of production, where each level of technological production relied on what came before, right? This kind of sequential information would have needed to be closely learned for this technology to be maintained in the population, much like we see in the right-hand side of the slide with the stone knapping tutorial for kids, right? It's a process learning activity. Because backed artifacts appear to score highly on two measures of technological complexity, number of tool components and number of steps in production, I was interested in whether one could predict their presence in the archaeological record, or at least the presence of backed artifact industries in the archaeological record, with quantitative estimates of past associated populations. The archaeological dataset I'll discuss here comprises the majority of African sites that are dated with radiometric ages between 120,000 and the Holocene. And what this equates to is 409 stratigraphic assemblages, or I should say stratified assemblages, so well contextualized assemblages, associated with 893 radiometric ages. I then extracted carrying capacity, in other words, climate-driven population density estimates associated with each dated assemblage in this analysis from these raster stacks published in this Nature paper in 2016. More recently, there are other environmentally developed predictions of past populations, and I'm in the process of incorporating these new estimates into some of my models. These data provide integrated spatially and temporally variable environmental information for the Pleistocene, as well as responding carrying capacity estimates, okay? Specifically, the authors used temperature, destruction, and carbon-based biomass to develop population estimates for given times and places in the past. So in terms of data structure, in terms of being both temporally and geographically variable, this kind of population data set is structurally appropriate to looking at certain aspects of the associated archaeological record. It's also been suggested, quite controversially, that the density of archaeological sites in space and time may be associated with the size or density of an associated hominin population. So, of course, site density-based estimates of past populations are problematic for a number of reasons, and we need to incorporate this uncertainty in our analyses, or at least be aware of it. These site-based estimates are prone to assumptions about the mobility of past populations, the reliability of geographic coverage of archaeological data, and several other things. But I think that few archaeologists would argue that site density has absolutely no relevance to past population density. I therefore focused the second analysis in Southern Africa, which has a relatively good coverage of data for hominin occupations over the last 120,000 years. And I used an automated moving window approach to calculate the number of contemporaneous occupations within a 50-kilometer radius of each assemblage. And I used this as a proxy, as an independent proxy for the associated density of occupations with a particular stratified assemblage. So just in short, I then modeled the presence or absence of backed artifact production at these sites as a function of directly associated population density. This plot is just modeling backed artifact presence on the y-axis, the probability of backed artifact industry presence on the y-axis, as a function of population density on the x-axis. And the size of the individual dots refers to the number of observations in a particular region of the plot, okay? So bigger dots just refers to more cases at a particular population density interval and level of likelihood of likelihood of backed artifact production. The model indicates a positive effect of human population density on the probability that past human groups utilized backed artifact production systems. This effect of population varies for different regions of Africa. It's most clear in Southern Africa, where I think we have relatively the best geographic coverage of data relative to other African regions. It's present in Eastern and Western Africa, but statistically it's very, very unstable, probably due to data coverage. And it's not at all evident in North Africa. So this is a 3D plot, and it's showing the combined interaction effect of site density and climate-driven population density on backed artifact production for the region of Southern Africa. So just to summarize what this plot is showing, it's showing that carrying capacity drives the effect of site density on the probability of backed artifact production. So at low environmental carrying capacities, site density is actually an incredibly poor predictor of the probability that one will see a backed artifact industry in the archaeological record. But as environmental carrying capacity increases, site density becomes gradually a better and better predictor of whether one sees backed artifacts in the archaeological record or not. And at the highest documented environmental carrying capacities, site density is actually a reasonably good predictor of backed artifact production. Looking at this far more simply, at higher environmental carrying capacities, you tend to have higher densities of archaeological sites in the landscape. Okay, this is plausible. And higher frequencies of these higher densities of sites in the landscape tend to be associated with backed artifact industries. The way I interpret this model personally is that carrying capacity is driving backed artifact industry presence in the archaeological record to some degree. But what allows one to explain this statistical relationship in a theoretical sense is a demographic mechanism, which is here represented by an archaeological estimate of site density. So a recent paper, actually one that came out just last week, has argued that the proliferation of backed artifacts in the Haas and Spoor technocomplex within the Southern African Middle Stone Age, so say between, well, depending on who you speak to, but say between 55 and 65,000 years ago, arose as a consequence of increasing social ties with geographically separated groups. So the idea that increasing population movement facilitated the emergence and transmission of backed artifact technologies potentially provides further support for demographic explanation for the emergence of this technology. So what if all stone tool types were responding to demography? To explore validating the effect of demography on backed artifact production, I modeled several other typical middle and later stone tool types with no obvious links to cultural complexity, including denticulates, points, and scrapers. A hypothetical similar positive effect of past population density on these other tool types would suggest that technologies were responding to demography independently of their complexity, right? So in other words, a pseudo-correlation. But these models show that other technologies were not responding to demographic change in any statistically convincing way. So just to sum up the second part of my talk with 3 points. Environmental carrying capacity and site-based density estimates together explain the presence of backed artifact industries in the Southern African later Pleistocene. The same linkage for other regions of Africa requires further investigation, better coverage of data, spatial and temporal coverage of data that we may never have. One possible explanation for these patterns is the operation of a demographic mechanism in the expression of complexity, cultural complexity in past populations. Exploring additional drivers for widespread changes in technology, such as archaeological and other indicators of risk, comprises a future avenue of this research. With that, I'm going to say thank you very much for your attention. And importantly, thank you to the institutions as well as close colleagues that continue to support my research. Thank you. So you have Cave of Hearts. You have Cave of Hearts, which obviously has Acheulean and Middle Stone Age. Apparently, I think there's also a disconformity between the Acheulean and Middle Stone Age at that site. It's also, it's got a history of excavation that goes back quite far. So I'm not sure about the context of the later Acheulean assemblage in terms of how meticulous the excavations were. I can't really comment on that, but certainly that's a relevant data point. Another site is Vonderwerk, of course. Vonderwerk is argued to have Forsmith. Although it's not a site that I'm familiar with practically at all, but my understanding of the literature is just in terms of quantity and density of material, it's a very different context to Montagu Cave. What I read from the volume of excavated deposits in the Acheulean horizons relative to the number of artifacts, it's much lower than Montagu Cave, but behaviorally it's a comparative data point. Those two sites are on very different climatic and ecological regions of South Africa, as you're aware of. In the Western Cape, there's Danafontein, but as I mentioned, the lithics assemblage from there is extremely small. So yeah, there's not a huge number of sites. That's why Montagu is really it's a freak. You go into sites like Montagu in the Western Cape and the Southern Cape, in my experience, and you expect to find later and Middle Stone Age. Acheulean doesn't even cross your mind, but that may have something to do with the formation of the deposits. I think we have pretty good data that there's a significant roof fall event between the Acheulean and the Middle Stone Age at Montagu Cave. What that means in terms of time between the two, I don't think we can speak to that yet. We just don't have that geochronological data.
Thank you, Will. I'm just going to repeat my question. You don't have to re-answer it. I was on mute, unfortunately, when I asked you. Sorry. So for the rest of you, what I asked Will was whether there are comparative sites with this, very late Acheulean assemblage that are well dated, and I think he's answered that in great detail. Thank you.
Was I also on mute, by the way?
No. You were coming through loud and clear. Yeah. So Jenna managed to WhatsApp me quickly while I was on mute. Sorry about that, guys. So we've got big thank yous from Gimo or Gimo Daniel or Daniel Gimo. I don't know if your name's flipped around the other way.
Gimo, yeah, it's from the museum.
Oh, great. Hello, Gimo. And Kenny Murphy also said thank you. Jean Gray is on there, and Deb Murray. And then Relo Pile, I think is the right way to pronounce it.
Yep.
Thank you, saying big thank you. And then we've got, I'm not sure who it is behind the Ansel archives, but just saying there was a very interesting talk. Thank you. Quick question. Is there any consistency or preference in the type of rock material used in the backed tools? If you mentioned that already, apologies, coffee breaks. So did you see any particular pattern in the back tools? I guess Montagu Cave, but I suppose that if you want to reflect on other sites, yeah.
So at Montagu Cave, they tend to be on CCS, so a form of chert, cryptocrystalline silica. There's also quite a bit of silkrete in the Harsenspoort at Montagu Cave. These are not in collections that I've worked with personally. I can only speak about what I've seen in terms of excavating at the site. Dr. Alex Sumners has been working on the Middle Stone Age assemblages from Montagu Cave, so she would be a much better authority in that regard. Generally speaking, backed artifacts in the Middle Stone Age in Southern Africa, if you compare backed artifact industries relative to what came before, there tends to be a shift towards more finer grained raw materials, which, at least at sites like Dipcliff, tend to implicate materials that are acquired over large distances. So, silkretes that are coming from the Reference River mouth, for example. So certainly there's an implication of a shift in, human use of the landscape and population mobility. But yeah, so in answer to your question, I think it depends where you are in South Africa. In the Western Cape, in the Hartenspoort, there's a preference for various kinds of silkretes. If you move further north, the Hartenspoort in Natal, backed artifacts they can be substantially smaller, the ones on crystal quartz, and you also have a lot more hornfels there. So indurated shale. In the central interior here in the Free State, if you have backed artifacts, they tend to be made exclusively on hornfels. So I think it just depends where you are in South Africa.
Yeah, definitely. The geology is definitely a very dominant factor in that. So Sona Sona Base is also a big thank you from Sona. Yes, and I think you made a great effort. Thank you, Will, for breaking down the terminology. I think everyone really appreciates that. You stopped yourself and explained some of the terms and the charts and try to make it easy for non-archaeologists, as easy as possible to understand. And please drop any comments if you guys have any. If there were any terms you still didn't understand, please feel free to send those through to us. But yes, I thought it was very accessible. So Ansel is Billy Pretorius. Hello, Billy. And yes, I don't think we have any more questions. Sometimes we get questions right at the end as we sign off, so which is quite a pity. So I hope everyone who needs to ask a question is ready to pick Will's brain while we still have him live. Yeah, your connection was very nice and clear. So that was very smooth this evening. Yeah.
I was very lucky.
Yeah. Yeah, we've had Eskom load shedding, we've bad internet connections from different places, you name it. So this was great. I think I don't see any further questions. Well, perhaps I'm going to ask another question. What do you think if we had to roll the research record forward 50 years from now, would you think that there will be more data stretching up the sort of West Africa band? So there was one map that you showed which showed a wonderful distribution of sites from southern Africa and then following sort of that East African corridor up to Ethiopia. Do you think that's a factor of where those sites from that period are limited to, or do you think it's more a lack of infrastructure around the research program? Because excavations and archaeological research is expensive. Going up the other corridor, if you like, up to North Africa.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would fully agree with the second point you made. So I think it's, in my personal opinion, it has to be geographic bias, right, in terms of research to some degree, because it is. So there's, some countries are easier to work in than others, right? Southern Africa, it's to set up an excavation, the logistics, various other dimensions that affect efficient and efficient field work. South Africa is a great place to do field projects, and we just happen to have so many more field projects here, right? Angola is more challenging, and look at the number of data points that we have in Angola. Very little, right? But I'm sure the archaeological record is we know from Desmond Clark's early books on that region that there's a huge amount of archaeology there, but there's just very few people working there. So I think geographic bias is a huge issue, and I should have perhaps brought that into the second part of my talk. That's something when you're looking at continental scale patterns, you have to factor into your analyses. Some regions have been worked on much more intensively than others. There's an intensity of research in Eastern Africa because um, for some similar reasons, but also because you have volcanic tuffs that you can date extremely accurately. So archaeologists like that, and there's a high intensity of work in the Eastern African Rift system. Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and geographic bias is a big problem.
Yeah, very well answered. We've got some more shout outs from Jenny Foster. She also says thank you. And Lloyd Rousseau. Hello, Lloyd. And he's saying thanks, Will. Enjoyed it very much. And Daria, I thought you were supposed to be on a plane. She just said that it was an awesome talk. And
Collecting someone from a plane.
okay, she's collecting someone. That makes sense then. And then we've got Kelly Murphy, who said, thanks again, it was very interesting, and she appreciates that you made it accessible to those of us who are interested but aren't academics, and we appreciate your taking the time to make us all smarter. So I think we've got all the questions. So I'm going to let you go and enjoy a great beer or glass of wine or a hot chocolate. It's freezing in Bloemfontein, apparently -9 tomorrow there. So that's
Tomorrow night, I think. Yeah.
the stronger souls. So if everyone's happy, I'm going to wrap it up there, guys. Will, thank you very much. I thought that was an excellent talk. You're yet another wonderful speaker that we've had on this YouTube channel, and your presentation and the slides and the graphs were all beautifully made and put together. Yes, I think you've left everyone with lots of food for thought, and I'm sure as the publications come out from Montagu Cave, this is certainly not the first or the last, I think, very exciting discussion that's going to happen around these results that you've given us an inkling about, really, this evening. So a little taster. Yes, and Yvonne is also saying very great thanks for your graphs and easy to grasp and an overload of dates. So there you go. So I would like you to have a great evening, and everyone else, thank you for attending the talk. There were just over 33, I think, or 35 of you this evening. Really appreciate everyone coming along and enjoying the talk this evening. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you can, so that you can get notifications about future talks when they are prepared. And just again, Will, I will bring you a bottle of wine when I see you. As a big
Thanks,
thank you.
buddy.
And
Thank you.
that was an excellent talk. And just have a wonderful evening. And